Well, well, well. Here we are, the seventh day past the day of resurrection. The tomb is empty still, and all the participants of the Easter event have returned home. I would imagine most of us have all the pastel colors of Easter out of sight in our homes, as well as all the fine linens have been all packed away and stored with some degree of reverence. Today's noon meal after church will certainly look much different than last week. Family and friends have gone home, and last week's meal is past tense. By this, the seventh day of the resurrection, the remnants of Easter feast are far removed from the refrigerator, and the Easter chocolates and those alien-like peeps no longer exist. No bias intended. Today's meal will look much more abbreviated with far few calories and carbs and less table settings. Looking around, it amuses me how the church attendance often drops dramatically compared to last week. Certainly, there is much less pomp and circumstance. All this to suggest the glamour of the Easter celebration is about to be shelved for another year. But as a reminder to all of us, the Easter morning of AD 33 fell much short of a big meal, ornate tablecloths, colorful peeps, and an orchestra of majestical music. Back in the day, the disciples huddled together in fear and not in faith. They were paying more attention to their wounds and giving no thought whatsoever as to how they looked or what they were going to consume, and certainly to any music to mark the event. And then, finally, they worshiped Jesus. Would you pray with me as we study the words of Matthew? Our resurrected Father in heaven, your message to us is heard loud and clear. Our faith will reach its deepest level once we surrender all to you without hesitation. On this seventh day past the resurrection, we bow before you in united brokenness to glorify you in thanksgiving and in reverence. Grant us that ability to walk with renewed vigor and purpose this day as we strive to grow deep and live tall. Amen. Turning back the pages to the early ministry of Jesus, we hear the words of Matthew tell us of the genesis of how Jesus selected his future followers for the ministry work that he had envisioned. That same vision ultimately included the crucifixion and the resurrection we most certainly reflected on this past Sunday. With the realization of his ministry ahead, Jesus needed numbers. He was well aware of the fact this was something he could not take on alone. But he needed not just workers, he needed believers. People willing to surrender and believe in him wholeheartedly. Early Christian tradition suggests that Jesus himself was a carpenter. And I'm going to go Greek on you here, but the word for carpenter also means a stonemason. Our archaeological evidence has proven that in the first century, Mediterranean region, stone was a primary building material. In addition to mud bricks, bricks were held together with mortar made of clay mixed with the local shells. Wooden trusses were used for the roofing materials, and some homes were actually made from hollowed-out caves, which made them more affordable and certainly more cooler. All this suggesting it was possible Jesus and Joseph worked more with stone than wood, since wood was scarce in the region. Either way, it seemed clear that Jesus was some sort of laborer. Now, here's a question I ask you to consider that maybe you've never thought about. Why did Jesus choose not to stay in his lane and choose disciples from the other laborers that he had lunch with every day? Seems like he would have come to know their strengths and abilities, and I would have imagined developed friendships with all of them. Instead, he abandoned that notion and went fishing. What do you suppose his mindset revealed? Knowing his key goal was reaching the common folk and people with humble backgrounds, could he not have achieved that with those laborers? It appears to me to be a fact worthy of our consideration. Or perhaps Jesus realized that those who chose fishing as a trade began each day, every day, with hope. Hope for a bountiful catch, hope for calm weather, and hope for a safe return home. Either way, it's my belief that Jesus scouted the shores of Galilee, observing people who fished, who they were, how they interacted, their character, their work ethic, and how much they believed in what they were doing. Let there be no doubt the choosing of future disciples was no random act. Jesus had the expectation of choosing an elite group of disciples that already had an endless amount of hope and were willing to believe in something unseen and never achieved before. Much like the story of the 20,000 workers that came together from Austria, Italy, Germany, when they came together day after day to work in miserable conditions to build a track for a train that did not exist. Hope was deeply embedded in them, believing deep, very deep in their hearts that someday a train would connect Venice and Vienna, crossing the Alps and allowing the flow of goods and people. That year, 1848, construction began on a railroad path through the portion of the Alps called the Sebring. Naysayers said, it can't be done. It won't be done. It was impossible. That's an absurd notion, they said. Laughable for sure, and just simply ridiculous. The mountains were much too steep, and the risk of avalanche was even greater. They were told the winter months would be too difficult for construction, and many people would be at risk. Yet still the project began on schedule, and the workers never wavered. After 7 long years of hard and deliberate construction, the final rail line produced 14 tunnels, 16 viaducts, 100 stone arches, and 11 bridges. It took an army of 20,000 hardworking, devoted, and believing workers to complete the task. Europe finally achieved a 7.5-hour railroad crossing across the Alps. The construction of this daunting mega project is impressive, but even more so is the fact that when the rail when the rail pass was finally built, there was not a train in existence capable of making the trip. They had completed a track that no trains were able to negotiate the steep elevation and sharp turns. Four locomotives were designed and tried and failed, forcing the train companies to rebuild, redesign. Those 20,000 workers from Austria, Italy, and Germany came together day after day in miserable conditions to build a track for a train that didn't exist. They created something out of nothing. Those construction workers truly believed, deep in their bones, that someday that train would come. Finally, it did. 4 long years of trials, and the good news was shared across the land. It took a lot of hope to believe in such a monumental achievement, but finally the 20,000 workers rejoiced in their labors. And so it was Jesus began his recruiting on the banks of Galilee, seeking fishermen full of hope and with a belief that they too would believe in something unseen and undefined and never accomplished before. Beyond the visible tools of the trades, the nets, the boats, the bait, Jesus no doubt observed a more rare than common trait that every fisherman shared: a unique bond with one another. The everyday life of a fisherman was filled with both simplicity and complexity. But there remained a bond of strength, companionship, and devotion and hope that seemingly caught the eye of Jesus. Remember, Jesus scouted the shores of Galilee, learning and observing. He watched as the fishermen teamed together in pulling their heavy nets from the waters, some weighing as much as 300 pounds. He took note when fishermen, never hesitating, reaching out to one another, helping to repair nets that required constant mending. Still, another characteristic that was necessary for devoted fishermen was the fact they had to endure the constant change in the weather year-round, never wavering. Summers averaged 88 degrees. Winters were short, with less than 50 days, but the winter months were turbulent with violent storms and heavy rains. Still, they fished. Still, they remained faithful. And still, they were hopeful. As Jesus calculated his future ministry, he knew working with committed fishermen would make it easier metaphor for his mission to make fishers of men, which would highlight the transformative nature and design for his future ministry. And so our story unfolds. Jesus begins to thread the needle for his future ministry. With laser focus, Jesus chose his first 2 disciples, Simon Peter and his hardworking brother Andrew. In the middle of their workday, they were casting their nets, and they had no idea how their lives were about to change. Jesus simply calls out, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." He didn't ask a question. "Hey guys, would you mind?" It was a command. And without a moment of hesitation, they immediately left their nets and followed him. And now the count is 2. As they continued their journey around the lake, Jesus stops and called out to James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Their heads were down, hard at work, as Jesus saw them repairing their nets with their father. Again, Jesus beckons them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. Now the count is 4. But listen carefully to the words of Matthew. Matthew was a writer of detail in his stories, in his writings. Simon called Peter, and his brother Andrew were the first to be summoned, followed by James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. What did you notice in that sentence? Did you notice that the commonality was the word brother? 2 sets of brothers. That's no accident. Jesus realized long before they were chosen that symbolically choosing brothers represented a unique source of strength and community. This was a highly sought-after characteristic for the future ministries of Jesus. Theologically, we're reminded also the concept of brothers was a fulfillment of the New Testament themes where families routinely played major role in God's plan. This shared respect reflected the selfless love that Jesus demonstrated along the way. In a broader sense, brotherhood fostered a sense of connectedness and responsibility towards one another, reinforcing the importance of community in faith. And not uncommon was that Jesus chose common folk over scholars and priests to be key figures going forward. His plan was to convey a message everyone could comprehend regardless of social status or education. Another common thread in this passage was immediately they left their boat and they followed. Now, I know I'm guilty. The month of March is March Madness, and I get engrossed in basketball. My wife says, "Here, when you set the table," I'm quick to say, "Oh, just 2 more minutes till the game's over." And I whine, and of course, 2 minutes in basketball could be 10 minutes, right? Or overtime. I don't say, I'm coming right now. I'm guilty of it. I would not make a good disciple, I suppose, in that sense. The fishermen, in the middle of their workday, attending their boats and repairing their nets, they dropped everything and followed Jesus. Now, why in the world didn't the men ask questions or insist on more details before being so eager to drop everything and go? Ever wonder why the 4 men made such an abrupt decision? You'd think they'd take time to discuss it with family or their boat buddies. Or maybe just say, "Jesus, let me think about it. Can you come back over here tomorrow and we'll talk about this?" Perhaps they sensed Jesus' charisma and just immediately trust him. I suppose that could happen. Even better, maybe they were tired of their stained and soiled garments reeking of the smell of fish every day. I know that happened. Leaning further, have you ever considered they may have been praying for a way out from under their labors and daily grind of their chosen field? Let's consider for a moment what the world looked like from their window. First of all, as a reminder, the Sea of Galilee is not a sea at all, it's a freshwater lake. In addition to supplying drinking water, it's critical for the farmers to grow cotton, alfalfa, bananas, and dates. But what attracted so many fishermen to the Sea of Galilee was a plenitude of fish. Specifically, it's been noted that there are 27 different species of fish, 19 of which are native, and 8 more been introduced in recent years. And still today, one of the most popular fish is tilapia, also known as St. Peter's fish. And then another premium fish that was highly in demand at the market was sardines. In the early beginning, those who fished made a pretty good living. But, as expected, the world changes. Even before Jesus was recruiting, the Romans were recruiting as well. They were recruiting taxes. The Romans adopted the model where there is a need, there is a profit. They implemented heavy taxes on all fish taken from the great bounty of the Sea of Galilee. And they forced many fishermen to either work longer hours or change their trade. Thinking they might outsmart the Romans, the fishermen considered transporting the fish to more outlying markets, and they were willing to pay even more for their product. It's a more complicated process involving salting the fish, sun-dyeing, or even pickling the fish in order for it to transport long distance. Well, it didn't take long for the Romans to see another way to tax even more. First, the boats were regulated by the state so that only the elite could profit from the labors of the fishermen. Secondly, the Romans took control of the roads and bridges that transported the fish being processed, and eventually the duty tax reached 5% of all fish. Now, on top of that, there were bribes that had to be paid to the people controlling the harbors. Might this have been reason enough for the 4 disciples to go AWOL? The very call for them to follow Jesus could free them from the bondage of taxation and having to consider another vocation. Whatever the case, I am sure you would agree with me that the first disciples had no clue what would be demanded of them in the future. Making a commitment to Jesus is serious business. Much like a commitment in marriage. We make a promise, we take a vow with a straight face and a contrite heart and words of truth, without the benefit of all the information and without full understanding of the demands that might arise in the years to come. When Jesus began his ministry, he called his disciples to follow him with a sense of urgency. In fact, Matthew uses the word immediately 18 times. When Jesus recruited his disciples, he didn't mince words. He didn't beg or dance or use fancy verbiage. There was no dog and pony show, no circus acts, no hiring bonus. Instead, the command was straightforward: follow me. Jesus knew if they trailed along with him, they would eventually discover how he served and showed compassion for all. If they followed him, they would see what a rich life can be when you turn your hurts into the world and throw yourself into mending what is broken. And Jesus still calls people to go fishing, even today. And the challenge remains for us to do something that is counter to much of what we see in our society today, or at the very least, to look at beyond ourselves and our own self-interest. Jesus desires for us to move beyond self-justifications. Jesus desires for us to grow away from blaming others. Jesus calls us to a richer life that results when we care about people who are poor and people who are oppressed. It's just a simple two-word command. Follow me. And perhaps you ask, how can you and I transform a broken world into a world filled with hope? Really nothing complicated here. We need only to allow our hearts to soften and treat one another with dignity and due respect. And that begins right here in this church, by countering callous disregard for people with the reminder of the sacredness of life. Here in this very church, we have much opportunity to offer hope and respond to the call to follow. We are a people of faith who continue to demonstrate our commitment to others in this community who may be materially or spiritually poor. You may be the next one who answers Christ in embracing someone who has lost a loved one. You may be the next one who responds to Christ in helping someone furnish their first apartment. You may very well be the next person who responds the way Christ would in helping feed others. You may be called to reach out to one another as a member of the church and say, "We miss you," or perhaps send a card or make a call. At the very least, you may be summoned by Christ to share a kind word to someone sitting beside you or behind you and offer a word or an embrace that gives them hope. Remember, those first 4 men had no clue what was about to come, but they still responded. They threw their lot with Jesus and became opponents of evil. They threw their lot with Jesus and became healers of wounds. They threw their lot with Jesus and became the light in places of darkness. They threw their lot with Jesus and changed the lives of future generations. Yes, Easter people, the empty tomb is 7 days past. And therein lies the good news, that the power of the resurrection did not end at the tomb. That same power still awakens people today. That same power still transforms people today. That same power of the resurrection still inspires followers of the risen Christ. And that same power found in the fellowship of Christ challenges us to stand tall and walk with renewed vigor and purpose in his footsteps every day. Our world has little trouble dishing up despair, but death never has the privilege of declaring the final word. Hope is alive because we are Easter people who heed the call of Christ to follow and to serve. We know not where the journey might take us, yet we wholeheartedly believe in the man that one day chose to go fishing. And because we believe, we can proclaim, we know who we are because we know who he is. Just a point to ponder. Amen.